Sustainable Shorelines from Long
Recording
Island
started.
to Lake Erie, and I am your host. These are some of the ground rules, especially for Mike and Laura. You should mute your phone mechanically. Everyone else is muted. If you want to, of course, talk to us, if you're a participant, please use the chat function, and there should be a little bubble that says chat, and you can chat to me or someone else. And and then if a survey pops up after the webinar, which I hope it does, please take that survey. We need it for our performance measures. Make sure, again, that you know that the webinar is being recorded, and if you are participating as part of a group, please send me the list of everyone so that we know who actually attended. And that's my email there. And so today is the webinar, and we have me, I'm the host, and then hopefully Debbie Corneau is going to just help with some of the logistics, because she's not quite on yet. And then we have speakers, me, I'm going to set the stage, Laura Schwanas from GEI Consultants, and we'll have a few discussions after that, and Laura's speaking on living shoreline approaches on Long Island. Then Mike Ludwig from COWI is speaking on living shoreline projects along the Long Island Sound, specifically in Westport, Connecticut, and then we'll have discussion and questions, and then we'll adjourn, and you'll have the survey. So I just want to talk a bit about the series objectives. We just want to make sure that our participants are aware of the range of options available for nature-based shoreline designs, related tools, and research. This is the November 8th series, but I have added more webinars. So December 16th is going to be enhancing armored shoreline and its techniques on prioritization. Then I'm going to be collaborating with the Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines with the New York City Waterfront Alliance. And then on February 17th, we'll be hearing some more projects on Niagara River and the Connecticut Lakeshore and Lakeshore of Connecticut. And then March 17th, more information on the Hudson River and Connecticut coast. The webinar registration that you received to register for this, you can go back and click on it and register for these other events. The Hudson River Sustainable Shorelines is the person that is bringing you this event, and I've been involved in this for 10 years, and we have many partners that we collaborate, which are across the bottom of the screen: the DEC, Carey Institute, Stevens Institute of Technology, Consensus Building Institute, and we've been funded by NOAA through the National Estuary Research Resource Science Collaborative. And we are working to promote choices that preserve or enhance the ecology and shoreline benefits while meeting engineering needs. We have an extensive website that you can see this link. I work for the Hudson River National Estuary Research Reserve. There are 28 reserves in the country. I am what's called the Estuary or Coastal Training Program Coordinator, and we have 4 research sites along the tidal Hudson River estuary from New York City north. Our sites are Piermont Marsh, Iona Island, Tivoli Bays, and Stockport Flats, and our office is in Norrie Point. Again, we have a 150-mile estuary, so the name of the Hudson, the Indian name, Muhankentuck, is the river that flows both ways. And I just want to say, as I always say in these webinars, there's many ways to refer to living soft shorelines, living shorelines, ecologically enhanced, nature-based, and we just ask that you really think about and make sure you define what you're talking about, and so that we all know we're all kind of on the same page for our discussion. And we're not doing that, so I will go back, and now I'm going to turn this over to Laura Schwanhoff, who is licensed. She's a landscape architect, and she works for GEI Consultants. So I'm going to make Laura the presenter, and Laura, so you can take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Emily. Thank you, everybody, for inviting me into your Friday afternoon. Last month, we learned about living shorelines on the Great Lakes. Today, I'd like to introduce you all to several living shorelines that have been installed on Long Island. Emily, we have one little glitch. I'm not able to advance. Oh, here we go. Okay.
Yep.
We're good now. Just an introduction to Long Island in the regional context. Long Island is that populated mecca that sits at the southeast corner of New York State, separated from Connecticut by the Long Island Sound and surrounded to the east and south by the Atlantic Ocean. Long Island is very exposed to the coastal forces of wind and waves. As an introduction, just wanted to share this slide that presents a living shoreline that was constructed over 10 years ago in Hempstead Harbor on the northwestern end of Long Island. Living shorelines are quite different from historic means of filling swamps and stabilizing shorelines with whatever construction debris was readily available. Essential to living shorelines is habitat protection and enhancement in a manner that still allows coastal processes to continue. Living shorelines are inherently flexible and sustainable by nature. Well-functioning systems will widen the transition zone between open water and upland, blurring the distinct boundaries imposed by historic fill placement or development. Living shorelines are dynamic, complex systems that require careful planning and proper site characterization. In order to withstand the rigors of time, battering winds, wave run-up, and extreme tidal fluctuations, a collaborative design approach embracing many disciplines is highly recommended. There are numerous benefits that can be derived from living shorelines, some of them obvious, some of them less intuitive. A very appealing benefit is their cost effectiveness and ease of installation. Mind you, living shorelines are not systems that can be built and forgotten or walked away from. They require long-term care and monitoring, just like you would with any living organism. What I presented here, I don't have exact figures, dollar figures to share because those will vary across the region based on the availability of components. But I can share with you the fact that raw material costs are much more affordable than what you typically find associated with structural alternatives such as timber or steel bulkheads or concrete seawalls. I also would like to warn you, besides the benefits of living shorelines, there are some shortfalls. Living shorelines are not a panacea for every eroding shorefront area. They're best suited for low to medium energy shorelines, and we'll be discussing that in a little while. Through years of trials and errors, I've selected very basic fundamental design considerations, which I'll go through in the following series of slides. First and foremost, location, location, location. It's the first critical piece of information you need to consider in design. Tidal ranges vary greatly across Long Island, from 9 to 10 feet on the western portion to 2 to 3 feet along the eastern portion of Long Island. And within the South Shore estuaries and bays, the fluctuations are moderated. These ranges are very important because they dictate the type and width of coastal planting zones you're going to be designing. Second piece of critical information is the distance of uninterrupted water or fetch. More exposed headlands is subject to higher wind and wave energies than irregular coves and smaller embayments. You can see in the lower photographs what happened even for structural measures that were not properly protected for some high energy storm events. I'm going to be using a number of terms. I just want to introduce them. That leads us to this analysis. Low energy sites are characterized by 1 to 2 foot wave heights and reduced storm surges. These are generally good potential sites to install for living shorelines. As the wave energy and exposure increases, you could consider hybrid structures which are better suited for those conditions. On extremely high energy sites, upland retreat or hard structures might be needed to stabilize shorelines that are subject to higher wave energy with waves greater than 5 feet in height. Another important consideration is controlling drainage. It's critical to avoid bluff slumps or erosion scarps. With drainage, we're not only talking about intercepting surface runoff. You have to be concerned about intercepting perched water levels that might break out along the face of the bluff or the shoreline and create seepage lines. Another design consideration that's often overlooked is determining the soil's natural angle of repose. If soils are left too steep, they will never become permanently stabilized with vegetation alone, and they'll require erosion control fabrics or other structural means to increase the shear strength and prevent sloughing. Another critical design consideration for slope stability, whether it's bluffs you're dealing with, stream beds, or banks, is protection of the toe or the base of the slope, as well as the sides of any shoreline protection treatment. Shown here are some good and bad examples of toe protection in more structural type of projects. Toe protection on living shorelines can simply be accomplished by anchoring coir logs or installing vertical batter boards or armor stone. I'd like to share a planning tool that I found to be very helpful. This vegetative treatment potential rating sheet was first developed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and further modified by the USDA. It assigns numeric values to many site characteristics that will help you determine whether or not a site can be stabilized with vegetation alone. Last but not least, is the proper selection of appropriate vegetation for treatments. In low-energy sites on flatter gradients, plugs or seeding alone might be used to stabilize a site. On steeper slopes or higher energy sites, deeper-rooted native grasses coupled with shrubs and erosion control blankets might be needed. Plants themselves can also provide structure when installed as bioengineered slope protection by applying root wads, fascine bundles, and live stakes, creating brush mattresses. These structural supports, the plants themselves provide structural support until the plants start to sprout and take root into the soil. Now I'd like to take you on a tour of 3 case studies. 2 are on the north shore of Long Island and 1 is in a south shore embayment. The first study is on Aunt Amy's Creek, Stony Brook Harbor. This is midway on Long Island on the North Shore, and this project involved a private residence that was perched on top of an eroding tidal creek. Site constraints on this project included discharge from a large stormwater outfall, which created flashy stormwater flows. Also difficult was the sliding salinity wedge that would happen every time the tides would come in and out. It's a low energy, low fetch site, but it has a very high tidal range of 7 to 8 feet. At the time of our first inspection, New York State DEC had a moratorium out on bulkheads, which are already present in the creek. And the town also had a prohibition against using armor stone at the base for a revetment. So we were faced with a real quandary on how to meet all the agency restrictions and still come up with a green solution. This slide shows the site conditions in 2007. The initial eroded condition, the banks are undercut, varying anywhere from 2.5 to 4 feet for the entire distance of the property of 400 feet. On one end of the property, the neighbor also had a floating dock, which was banging up against the toe of the slope. Planning began in May of 2007 with our initial site reconnaissance. Following that, a site topographic survey was conducted, and we developed the plans, specifications, and all the permit application materials were submitted in November of 2007. Because our living shoreline components in this case were relatively unknown to the regulators and non-conventional practices that engineers were not familiar with, it resulted in a lengthy review period by the agencies. What we ultimately designed, and I'll just share this, take a look at the lower left photograph, the lower left graphic. Live crib wall was proposed along the 2 steepest sections of the bank. And the central section, which was less steep, was proposed to be covered by a brush mattress. Due to the extensive agency review period, the initial erosion scarp of 2 to 4 feet widened and became something larger than 5 feet in width, which exacerbated, problems on the site and required additional engineering modifications to be drafted up. Mind you, this was after the permit drawings were already submitted, and as a landscape architect, my design authority only extends to structures with a height of 4 feet. Taller structures require engineering signature and stamps. So we had to pull somebody in to make those modifications to the permit drawings and then get additional approvals from the agencies. Finally, we received the permits and construction began in 2009. These photographs show you the live timber crib wall, which is built basically like linking logs stacked upon each other with voids in between, and those alternating rungs are interplanted with live stakes and shrubs to hold the fabric together. During excavation of the live crib wall, we encountered spring seeps that we didn't know about previously, which could threaten the integrity of the slope. Of course, field changes are always need to be made, and we included some geogrid tiebacks and raised the stone infill so that the flows could continue through the bottom of the project and reduce hydrostatic pressure. As described earlier, the crib wall was installed on the steeper portions of the slope. You can see it recently completed there on the photo to the right, and that's just below where the house sits. On the less steep sections, a brush mattress was installed on the gentle slopes. The upper left shows the cut live stakes that were used to create fascine bundles at the base of the brush mattress, and the live whips that were placed in between the rungs in the crib wall. This is an as-built drawing that shows how the live crib wall was constructed, with the stone drainage layer at the base and the alternating layers of timber and live stakes. The goal of any crib wall is to provide a temporary structure until the plants themselves take root and become the fabric that holds the entire slope in place. On this project, we were required to do 5 years of post-construction monitoring. Shown here is the progression over those 5 years. What I'd like to just mention in this series of slides about the brush mattress is a bioengineering technique that's been applied many times in riverine settings. We had to modify that design so that we could include salt-tolerant shrubs at the base. The initial approach using willows and dogwoods was great when the plants just started to sprout, but over time, the willows and dogwoods in the lower part of the rungs of the live crib wall and the brush mattress did not hold up, and we had to replace those over time. This slide also shows the vegetative growth through the crib wall over the 5-year monitoring period. You can see in the 1-year and 3-year photos that the shrubs are very well established, but by 5 years, you're starting to see openings at the bottom of the crib wall. Those openings were treated afterwards with inserting tubing shrubs, groundsel bush and marsh elder, that would withstand the salinity wedge that we were experiencing. I can tell you that there is no nursery supply right now that has salt shrubs on Long Island or anywhere in the Northeast of a size or length that can be used as live stakes. So that is a challenge that we're facing right now, and I've discussed it with plant materials center managers and several nurseries. So how is this living shoreline holding up? It withstood the forces of Hurricane Sandy and several northeasters, but changes to the channel morphology and rising water levels have caused us to rethink the current needs on the site. Stone toe protection is finally being considered after 5 years of monitoring as a viable treatment, and has gotten the green light from some of the regulatory agencies. We're going to try to also implement a pilot coir log and rib mussel seeding at the western end of the crib wall where the water levels are deeper. We're going to switch over now to a South Shore location at northern Captree Island. This is located in Great South Bay. The area is characterized by a 1 to 2 foot tidal range, but what makes things difficult is the 2 to 4 mile fetch that it's exposed to. The Long Island Power Authority installed a submarine cable across the bay, and we were tasked with designing the restoration on the shorefront where the cable transitioned to Captree Island to join the electrical substation further down the parkway. Before and after the cable installation, we had to conduct some eelgrass transplanting from the submerged aquatic beds that would have been impacted. And then after the cable was in place, the area was replanted with eelgrass plugs. The partners on this project included the utility staff, Cornell Cooperative Extension, who assisted with the submerged aquatic vegetation, permitting specialists, wetland ecologists, and a landscape architect, which kind of underscores the need to have a interdisciplinary approach to come up with viable solutions. Depicted here is the upland transition onto Captree Island. Constraints at the site included working within the confines of the utilities general permit. Tow protection was limited by the depth of the buried cable, and we couldn't place any materials below mean high water based on the permit conditions. What we wound up doing is stacking or terracing coir logs, installing plug plantings, native seeding, placed jute, and plugged dormant beach grass through that jute. Within very short time, you see in the photograph to the right, from April into August, we had very good early vegetative success. The native grasses and dormant beach grass plugs established well. Shrubs at the toe of the slope are thriving and protecting the base. However, Hurricane Sandy and some nor'easters were not so kind to our living shoreline. We believe that the long fetch and the lack of additional tow protection could have solved the problem at this site, but we were constrained under the permit conditions. What do we do now? A new solution? Possibly add more reinforcement to the stacked coir logs, tying them down using duckbill anchors and cable, and that might prevent the undermining that was seen in the previous photo. That type of protection has been already installed up in Massachusetts. This tiered approach incorporating the anchors, geogrid, and native plantings appears to be doing very well. And we'll wait to see how that continues to flourish. And the last case study is a North Shore Long Island site at Udall's Mill Pond. It's a tidally influenced coastal pond managed by Nassau County Department of Public Works. The challenges on this project included a sliding salinity gradient, the fact that the pond is surrounded by an urbanized watershed with high sediment deliveries, and invasive species were prevalent. Our charge was to remove the invasive species, replace them with natives, restore the habitat, and do what we can to improve water quality. In this low-energy environment, a lot can be done with plants alone. We were able to establish a brush mattress along the bank, shown in the upper left. We replaced the common reed, the bittersweet, and black locust saplings with a mixture of buttonbush, elderberry, beach plum, bayberry, pasture rose, and native grasses and wildflowers. These are more recent shots of the pond. The pond perimeter was also planted to salt marsh species, including smooth cordgrass, salt meadow cordgrass, various sedges, and bulrushes. One interesting thing to note on this project, there were mud flats in the center of the pond that were purposely left open to continue to provide feeding and roosting areas for shore and wading birds. But on the edges of those islands, the peripheries were planted to stabilize the banks and also to improve water quality. Thank you for letting me give you an overview of what we've been doing here on Long Island. I think we covered a number of different important topics, the benefits and shortfalls of living shorelines, many of the key design considerations. Sure, there's more than 7, but I tried to highlight some of the most prominent ones, and the method to select the appropriate treatment for low, medium, or high energy shoreline areas. I'd be happy to answer any additional questions when we get to the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. This is Emily. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Laura, I had one question that I typed in the UDOL project. How were the invasives removed? Was that
on the UDOL? On the UDOL's project, we actually had an excavator that would pull out the banks. There was no spraying of any of the vegetation. It was all mechanically removed. An excavator took out the invasive shrubs and trees along the bank and the common reed. You'll note, though, that we couldn't get the common reed off the entire periphery of the pond because that was outside the project area.
Okay, thank you. And then I also had a question about, in the first project, you said that the town had restrictions on armoring the toe. And is that common in Long Island that towns put those kind of restrictions, or is that unique?
It just happened to coincide. Yeah, it just happened to coincide with the time that New York State DEC placed a moratorium on bulkheading. So we were kind of left with our hands tied on what we could do on that site and had to come up with an innovative green approach. As I said, most recently, after these 5 years of monitoring and receiving all the monitoring reports, the town has somewhat rescinded that prohibition and is allowing us to consider stone at the toe, especially in light of the fact that the channel morphology changed and it appears that the water levels are increasing.
Okay, thank you. And I also wanted to know, what is the requirement? You said that in one of the projects that once the height becomes greater than 4 or 5 feet that you need an engineering stamp, and is that a state requirement, or what is the threshold for that, or the regulation?
Just as background. Yeah, as background, I'm a landscape architect and a wetland scientist, but my licensure does not allow me to design structures with an effective height of 5 feet or more. So during the time period that it took to get all of the approvals on the permit submittals, the bank kept eroding and then got to a point where the structure needed along the shorefront reached a height of 5 to 6 feet, and it went beyond my authority as a landscape architect to design that type of structure. So in New York State, you have to pull on board a licensed professional engineer to stamp, to review and stamp and seal those drawings, which was also somewhat of a challenge because they were not familiar with any practice like this. They're more familiar with conventional hardening structures. And it took a while to find just the individual that would work with us on the design modifications for the crib wall.
Okay, thank you so much. We have 2 questions from the audience. One is, in case study 1, the property looked large enough to consider relocation of the house. Was this discussed as an option instead of shoreline stabilization?
That's a very good question. The issue here is that the house is a historic structure, basically built with Frank Lloyd Wright type architecture. Moving the house on that lot was not something that was going to be considered by the homeowner. Okay, that seems like a logical answer. Then the next question is, at Amy's Creek, what monitoring, if any, was performed to identify water level increases and morphology changes? Was it just based on visual observations? That's correct, Emily. For, up until now, it's been all visual observations. There were no requirements in the, on behalf of the state or the town permitting, stating that we had to do cross sections or long-term bathymetry studies in the creek. It's something to be considered in looking at some of these more restricted locations that might be modified over time with sea level rise, or in this case, increased stormwater runoff from an urban watershed.
Okay, and one more question. In case study 2, was there a wave or return interval analysis done to determine resilience of the design to wave energy?
That's also a great question. Was it done? No, and that's what we learned after installing this project, that would have helped to reveal some of the issues we had here. If we were to do this again, obviously there would be more preparation and thought put into the final design of a living shoreline. But understand again that we were also constrained by the permit conditions that we were working under. We could not use any hard structure at the toe, and we couldn't anchor anything around the shallow cable installation.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate that. I don't believe there's any more questions, so we're going to go back to, we will, first of all, I'm going to thank you so much, Laura, and I'm going to take control back. And in a minute, again, if participants have any more questions, you can still put them in and we can try to ask them at the end. And I am going to, though, we're all going to learn how to use the chat function, because I have a specific question for you. And we're not asking that one. So this is the one I want to ask you. Please type in the chat box. This is your opinion only. In your opinion, what is the biggest barrier to the implementation of nature-based shoreline projects? So if you would just all bear with me and try to put that answer in, we'd really like your participation. If you should be able to look at the top of your screen and find the chat function and type it in. And the panelists can do this also. Okay, and while you're doing that, this is really for, hopefully you can all see everyone's answer, and I can try to share that with you by email. In the meantime now, while you're typing, I'm just going to move the ball over to give Mike Ludwig control, and he can start his presentation. Again, Mike is an engineer with Mike, I think you need to you're in control, so you should bring up your presentation at the top of the screen. Oh, there you are. Okay. So, Mike, you can go ahead and start talking, and you're in control.
I'm trying to get the program up and running here, and it's being a little resistant.
Okay, I can see your presentation.
but I'm not seeing it on the bigger screen here.
You're not seeing it on your screen?
No. And when I go to it, it kicks, it doesn't catch it.
So are you trying to, so I can hear someone typing. Are you typing?
No, that's not me.
Okay.
I would have thought that I would just pick it up.
Okay. At the top of the screen, there should be some numbers. You know what? I can just forward the, well, can you see your presentation?
No, I still can't.
Okay. I'm going to ask Debbie Cornu to help out here.
Thank you.
If I can unmute. Deb, are you there? Can you help us with
Yes. Hi, Emily. I'm here. Michael, now
okay.
You have a document that you're opening on your PC?
No. You guys have the document.
And they're all opened
Yeah.
up at the top, correct?
Yep.
Yes.
I see Ludwig, I see SS Project, and another one.
That's right.
Schwanoff, I think. Can you click on any of those tabs?
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
As if by magic. All right.
See, you just needed to unmute
magic
me.
touch. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. So Mike, do you see how you advance the slides then?
Yeah, not a problem.
Okay.
Well, good afternoon,
All right.
fellow Americans. And thank you so much, Emily, for inviting us. I'm actually more of a marine ecologist than an engineer, but I work for an engineering company, so we integrate our activities because we've learned that when you engineer something or when you do a biological project, it's really helpful to have that integration of goals and objectives shooting towards a common objective. And so in the case of what I'd like to talk to you this afternoon about on the Living Shorelines projects, I'm going to focus on a project that we did in Westport, Connecticut, and I think that you'll find that we're going to integrate very well with what you've learned from Laura so far this morning. And so my presentation outline is the usual format. We're going to talk about site conditions and problem definitions and constraints. Alternative assessments is important because what frequently happens is that even these green shorelines, as Laura pointed out to you, can become a Clean Water Act Section 404 activity that requires you evolve or you develop a alternatives analysis that indicates that this is the least environmentally degrading activity that you might come up with. And the little insert pictures here are some wave activities that we've looked at, a shoreline structure that's been undermined in the center, and then in the lower part, a interesting Cobbly Beach, which has a intertidal salt marshes, smooth cordgrass growth on it, which kind of defies logic because of the energy at the area. We look at design solutions and installation. I'll do quick performance evaluations and some lessons learned and conclusions. And if you would, please hold your questions until the end, as you did with Laura, and let's see who we are. This is who I am. I am a biology regulatory services project manager. I've been in the business more years than a lot of people have been alive, but that's my problem, not yours. I was formerly the Regional Regulatory Affairs Coordinator for the Habitat Conservation Division of the National Marine Fisheries Service. So I got to look at a significant number of projects in the Northeast and throughout the United States, and I've worked in Europe and Asia as well. And I've continued that in this last 10 years since we joined COE in 2007 to become an international company. So what is natural or green resilience for sustainable shorelines? And Laura spoke to it, but I wanted to really go back and highlight a couple of the components of it, and then particularly the second bullet. But the shoreline structures that seek to protect natural systems. So often when we see a shoreline protection project, it's a structure of immense proportions designed to withstand the storm of record, and so the day-to-day events are cast asunder or cast aside in the process. But what we're trying to do is find a way to maintain the ecological functions and values of an area within the goals and objectives of the project planner. But it's really, really important to understand that these designs do not attain full protection. They do provide some level of protection up to their design characteristics. In other words, the 10-year storm or the 20-year storm or something like that. But they are ultimately going to fail. And in that failure, we want to design in characteristics that allow for some level of natural recovery by incorporating whatever resiliency characteristics that we can do. And I'd like to take a moment and talk just about one. I'd like to talk about American beach grass or dune grass, Ammophila breviculata. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's the grass that you see on the dune line on beaches, frequently planted these days, and it has proven itself time and time again to be an extremely useful vegetation, natural vegetation, in storm situations where the dune is being significantly eroded by overtopping. Hurricane Superstorm Sandy is not really a good example of what might happen because its return frequency is so rare. But if we look at what happened in the periphery and even in some of the central portions of where Sandy came ashore, we see that the presence of dune grass, American beach grass, was a significant stabilizer, and it also slowed the rate of erosion, not by its sacrificial presence. So we saw that there's some real benefits to that. And curiously enough, though, when we plant American beach grass, one of the worst things that can happen to that grass is that we don't allow for control of human activities, either walking across it or driving across it. We find that the grass does not support any kind of compaction or bending because the stems and the leaves are so weak. So it's really important to kind of understand that while we're doing all of these really useful things, sometimes the best laid plans of mice and men get destroyed simply by a ignorance of how sensitive this grass is to human activity while it can face into the teeth of something like Hurricane Sandy. That's a good thing to keep in mind. And then the other thing I'd like to do before I move on is reiterate that thought that these projects don't attain full protection. So frequently when we're selling them to clients, we get a fair amount of pushback on, well, why am I doing this if I'm going to have to do it every 10 years? And the reason is that as we go through this, you'll see that there is the use of these things make it far easier to get permits and meet regulatory goals and objectives without so much of the regulatory requirements. So I'd like to talk to you about Cedar Point Yacht Club today. It's located in Westport, Connecticut, in central Fairfield County. Its membership is a community of sailors that have been there for about 115 years. In the face of hurricanes and storms, nor'easters, and all the rest of that stuff. And it's a participatory club with a social and cruising record that has expanded over the years. And in expanding over the years, the site conditions at the site really merit some considerations, because as Laura was talking about, understanding what's there and what might be the sources of the problem are really important in the designing of a resilience project. So this is on the North Shore of Long Island. It's as any place in western Long Island Sound, a developed shoreline. Its basin in which the marina sits and our erosion problem occurs is protected from Long Island Sound along the southern and eastern faces, so fetch is not a significant issue. But it is open on the north, facing into the Saugatuck River. It has a significant amount of erodible soils, which are glacial outwash in nature, so they're primarily sands and silts with some gravel, and there's not a lot of compaction. It's already been relocated at least once by the erosion and waterborne activity from the glaciers as they retreated about 10,000 years ago. But it's subject to overwash. In other words, that marsh can actually be inundated by a storm condition. And while I'm a little loath to use Sandy, I mean, we know that in western Long Island Sound, we had a storm surge in excess of 13 feet in most places. So what happened is we saw that those coastal structures, soft or hard, were frequently overwhelmed and overtopped, and erosion occurred behind them. But we also saw that in the prior year in Irene and in Tropical Storm Lee that most people don't like to talk about. But those two storms happened within about 2 weeks of each other and caused a significant amount of destabilization of the coastal area. As I said, the little red dot on this slide right here shows where the club is located. So what is the problem that we're facing here? Well, and as I said, here's the basin on that western end, just to the left of my red dot. The marina basin is maintained by periodic dredging of the glacial outwash sands and gravel material, and the dredging has actually become a part of their erosion problem by removing the area or the material below mean low water. You create a vertical plane, a vertical cutoff that the adjacent slope is now subject to erosion from, and you get a significant amount of deterioration of that shoreline. Here's a plan view look at the project, and what we're looking at is the green area, which is that intertidal salt marsh, and then behind it some purple high marsh, and then into some shrubs. But as you can see, the marina for the club actually abuts that intertidal zone, and so we get a stress environment from the get-go. Not only are we seeing waves from small wave energy passing completely through the marina, but also we see boating activity from boaters coming and going from their slips. A bigger view of the situation is that, so we see this erosion above and below the salt marsh. The face of the salt marsh, the outward face of the salt marsh is being eroded, and there are overwashing events when storm tides are so high that they exceed the normal high tide line and are eroding behind the marsh. So we're destabilizing the entire shoreline. From a biological standpoint, we've got some high marsh vegetation, but it's very minor in characteristics and presence. The intertidal marsh is a dominant species in the area. Common reedgrass, shrubs, and trees are above that. And then we see a pretty stable fiddler crab and oyster population. Laura, I do want to say one thing that Laura raised as a point. If the only thing you can do in an area is plant common reedgrass, and that does grow down below the high tide line, I encourage you to plant Phragmites or common reedgrass. It's actually, because of the extensive rhizome nature of the material, it becomes a very good shoreline stabilizer. Makes the people crazy and the fire department nuts because it's a fire hazard, but you gotta love it for holding the shoreline. And so here's a look across that southern face, and as you can see, the dark areas in the left picture is the Spartina alterniflora interface. You can see them more closely in the right-hand side picture, and what you see is erosion and destabilization of the marsh mat in the area. A little better close-up of it, you can see that there's actually a drop-off of the marsh mat that's being deteriorated by the wave activity from boats and normal wave patterns in the area. But we did a wave study just to take a look at it, and we were looking at classically waves of about 6 inches or less in the area. Another way to look at this is in cross-section, where you can see that the high tide line is slightly below what's called the CJL line. The CJL line is the Connecticut jurisdictional line. That's where the regulatory agency within the state of Connecticut, the Connecticut DEEP, Office of Long Island Sound Programs, regulates to. It's a little different than New York State, which regulates within a set distance from mean sea level or the high tide line. So there's some game-changing and game-playing necessary to be able to move your project forward. We did a shoreline analysis. Fortunately, we were able to go back and take collect some aerial photographs of the area, and you can see that if you look at the lineage in here, the red line indicates what the shoreline looked like back before Irene, Lee, and Sandy wandered through, and then the subsequent shoreline is now the red line, where things have been changed pretty significantly. While we haven't lost all of the vegetation in the area, you can see that overtopping and subsequent erosion behind it caused some real problems. In thinking about the constraints for this project then, what our client wanted was they wanted an engineered solution that was as permanent as one can get, but cost-effective, and you balance permanency with cost-effective, and I'll talk more to that in a minute. And it's also having some regulatory acceptability. Remember, as I said, from the Fed standpoint, these projects, or these kinds of projects, can stimulate a Clean Water Act action, which requires a lot of involvement in an individual permitting process and justifications for the selection of it. And that's this alternative assessment and evaluation. Why did you select this as the least environmentally impacting project activity that you could? And so some of the things that we were looking at when we considered the alternatives was, can we just steel sheet pile this thing and walk away? It certainly would be permanent and robust. It's a well-understood design, but it's expensive. Multiple thousands of dollars per linear foot. We needed 700 feet in here. That was really exceeded the club's operating budget for several decades. So they tried to ask us to find other things. And there's regulatory issues. As Laura said, when you put in a bulkhead, you get some issues. You get wave reflection and refraction off of those bulkheads, which exacerbates the rate of erosion in other locations. So years ago, we began putting riprap in front of these bulkheads as a wave or wave and energy attenuation system. And we created a new habitat. Nice idea, but sometimes you get folks who just don't want to look at riprap and a bulkhead. So if you're just going to go with the riprap, that's also pretty permanent if it's correctly designed and robust enough to do it. It also is a well-understood design. It's moderately priced, about $40 a yard for the rock, $40 to $45 a yard for typical riprap rock sizes, and it has less regulatory concerns than the other one, the steel sheet bulkhead. Vegetated slopes. The sustainability, survivability, and maintenance issues play off in that relationship. You need a design certification, because what is the level of protection that you're affording to your client? Is it the 10-year storm or the 20-year storm or the 50-year storm, or at the rate we're having 100-year storms, the 2-year storm? Relatively inexpensive, the initial costs, and then there's some maintenance to make sure that the right vegetation is there. As you can see, we've got some Phragmites in that little triangular picture on the right growing in there. But as I said, I mean, if that's what grows there, you get some pretty good benefits out of that stuff. Makes the neighbors crazy, but it is what it is. Regulatory friendly. We can do a reinforced vegetative slope. You can get some improved longevity. It's better understood than some of the just vegetated slopes. It also is moderately priced, and it also only raises a moderate level of concerns. Reinforced vegetative slopes, like gabion mats, create some real acid indigestion, because as this picture depicts, there are some real issues about what's happening. Hard it is to believe that salt marsh is growing in a 6-inch thick riprap mat, and we're actually slightly above the high tide line in the central portion of the picture, where you can see through the bottom of the gabion mat chain link material that there is a filter fabric underneath of it, which should have pretty much inhibited vegetative growth in the area. If you look at the top center of the picture, you can see the top of the gabion blanket. And what's missing? All of the rock. One of the biggest problems we have with gabion materials is that it is free rocks for everybody from age 3 to 103. Anybody who comes to the beach immediately collects, or the shoreline, immediately begins to try and find a way to get my rocks out of the gabion basket and throw them into the water. So we get a fairly large amount of chaos and destruction. When you look at the cross-section drawing here, you can see that we were proposing or considering putting that gabion mat behind the intertidal marsh and below it in front of it, and also up onto the face of the marsh to create some alteration and wave attenuation, alteration of the wave energy that was striking the face of the natural marsh mat, and also some wave breaking so that it would reduce its impact. So we looked at reinforced vegetative slopes, gabion mats, the riprap sill. Like I said, it has a vandalism problem. It's moderately priced. And then we also considered reinforced a vegetative slope using core mats of either jute material or coconut fiber, and you get some pretty interesting longevity out of it. We realized that when they first came out on the market about 15 years ago, they proved relatively unsuccessful because of the people who were involved in installing them and also in selling them really didn't have an appreciation for how much energy waves created. And so we would routinely see mats and core logs rolled up across the salt marsh after the first storm. Not a good thing. Since then, people have learned that you really need to put some serious retention devices, staking typically, on these things to be able to solve your migration problems. But we also get some really good regulatory response from it. And so if you think back a minute to the gabion pads, you can see that landward of in this cross-sectional drawing, landward of the salt marsh, we've placed a 6-inch thick core mattress which was filled with sand to encourage growth there, and we have a core log in front of the toe of the salt marsh to provide that wave attenuation and disruption. What's up here? Come on. Okay, so what was our design solution? Well, kind of obvious. We went with the reinforced vegetated slope, the corner mats. Why? Because we had a faster implementation process. We could deal with the erosion that was occurring on site quickly. It was cost effective. We could monitor it for effectiveness simply by walking along the shoreline, either above it or below it, we had a pretty low wave energy environment with some infrequent overtopping. Typical of storms, you can't always have them come at low tide, or you can't have them always come at half tide, so that their energy is absorbed within that intertidal zone. They're going to come whenever they want, typically on a Friday night about 2 o'clock in the morning, or Saturday morning at 2 o'clock. Acceptable levels of protection and risk. We could say, hey, we think you're going to get a 10 or 20-year storm protection from here. And so what we looked at was, how can we do that? And what we did was we placed a core log in front of the salt marshes, I pointed out in that prior slide, and we built a structure behind it so that the upland could be protected as well. What did installation look like? Well, installation was done in April, before the growing season had really begun, to be able to maximize the value of natural growth occurring up through them. Here's the core logs in the right picture. You can see they follow the dominant erosion zones. You can see how close the boating activity is. And then in the lower left-hand corner of that picture on the right, you can see the wave of fear that was striking the shoreline, about a cat's paw, 3 to 4 inches high, but it was enough to create an erosive environment. Here's some more pictures of what it looked like by May. And you can see in that lower right-hand picture that we're already seeing some vegetation moving up through the core mats that we've laid. We planted nothing. There was no planting because the state of Connecticut is very reluctant to allow people to plant material because we don't know where it came from, we don't know what its life expectancy is. We would much rather have natural seeding occurring. And in these kinds of environments, when there's so much vegetation in close proximity, why not take advantage of it? So, comments on the installation. The material was relatively available. We did a little bit of substitution because 700 feet of core log wasn't immediately available. The installation took a little bit longer than we thought because the contractor, although he was the low bidder, and we thought we had checked out his CV and we did due diligence on his capabilities, he really hadn't worked in this kind of an environment effectively before. So we needed to sort of hold his hand. So we did some performance evaluation, and we looked at, this is the installation period. As you can see, the marsh is now fully in growth phase. The back looks a little, the upper portion of the area looks a little underutilized so far, but as time went on, here we are in early July, we can see in the middle picture some vegetation coming up, and also we can see that the high marsh vegetation is also beginning to sprout through here. And we found that the high marsh, the Iva frutescens is a pretty good invasive species, if you will. We don't want to call it that, but it has the wherewithal to be able to do it. By late July, you can see that we're actually getting some pretty good growth. The Spartina alterniflora in the foreground on the left side is doing relatively well. We have about a 6-foot tide here, so we expect that marsh vegetation is going to grow to be about 4 feet high. But in the background, in the central and the right picture, you can see we're getting some pretty interesting vegetative growth there. And then come August, you can see that that growth has actually continued along. You can see that in that far right picture, the Spartina has already shifted to its reproductive growth. So we're getting a fairly large amount of seed in the area to move things along. And then, so we're looking at performance evaluation. It filled in nicely during the year, during that first growing season. Remember that growing season actually stops when the seeding happens. So come August, you're pretty much seeing all of the vegetative infilling that you're going to see for the year. We didn't see any significant issues. Everybody was pretty happy. The shoreline was relatively stable. We didn't see a whole lot of damage in the winter of 2015-2016, although, you know, we had a pretty mild winter. We had a couple of quick cold spots, but other than that, it was a pretty easy winter. So we're going to go continue to look at what happened. So what have we learned out of all of this? Well, we've learned that we need some additional regulatory guidance, or we need to guide regulatory agencies. And that works two ways. Sometimes we walk into a regulatory meeting and there's a couple of wetland ecologists in there. But most of the time we find that there's a wildlife biologist who has never actually worked with salt marshes before. And so we have to sell it based on literature and things like that. Additional design guidance from those regulatory agencies and to those agencies is what we have gotten involved in. There needs to be some client education. Expectation always exceeds reality in these kinds of events. And the lessons learned. Involve your client early and as often as possible in those decision-making process so they have an appreciation for what's up. And then monitoring is critical to help everybody move ahead on what we might find in the future. And with that in mind and with that in hand, I'll take your questions. If you'd like to contact me, that's my email address in the lower left-hand corner of this last slide.
Thank you, Michael. That was very interesting, and I'm going to check if we have any questions. I had a question that, just clarifying then, you didn't plant anything, including you didn't plant anything in the core log. Is that correct?
That's correct. We allowed for natural invasive growth of it. And I see I've got a question here. I don't know if it's the first, given the...
I guess it, I can read it for you. I have one question.
Back. Okay.
I see 8. Yeah.
Okay.
Some of these are from the previous question. So, given that Phragmites is known to be extremely invasive and can destabilize shorelines, that is, thick growth can result in storm washouts, it seems irresponsible to advocate for planting it even in extreme circumstances. So that's a kind of a comment. Do you want to say anything more about that?
I agree 114% with whoever made that statement. I did not mean to imply that you should actively go out and plant Phragmites. But what you might want to consider is if you have an area where Phragmites is present and it's been there for any period of time, and you've got a decent salt marsh, a saline water environment, you could utilize it within your shoreline resilience project and plant in front of it or plant around it, because ripping it out is extremely difficult to do successfully. We've been trying to do that for almost 40 years in the state of Connecticut in a number of wetland restoration projects, and with varying degrees of success. And probably the best way to get it out, if you are pressed, is multiple years of spraying and mowing it. And in doing that, you create an environment where some of the neighbors generally tend to get upset. And then because you've got all of this material mowed in there and you can't easily get it out, you create a heck of a fire condition. So sometimes if you can leave it and build what you need around it, it makes sense. But plant it, no. And if I ever said that, I need to be face-slapped.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mike. I have a question from Carolyn LaBarbiere. When you presented the client with the selected alternative, was there any pushback or desire to go more structural? And if so, how did you convince the client to go with the vegetative slope?
As part of our review, when we submit a package to a client, we give them a risk assessment. What's the likelihood that your project of any kind, any of these alternatives, is going to stay there? And then we do an opinion of probable cost. And that opinion of probable cost frequently scares the living daylights out of the client. And so you wind up considering those alternatives that are much more compatible with the environment and really do fit within the resilience situation. one of the things that we see is that, and in this, at the yacht club, we were really fortunate. The entire length of the erosion zone, that southern face, was all held by the client. And so we didn't have to stop halfway across it. We could stabilize the entire shoreline. That frequently happens on projects where the client wants it done, but then how do you address the problem that the adjacent property owner does not want it and is seeing more or even more erosion than you are on your client's property. So we wind up doing some sales in terms of the concept by visiting the adjacent property owners prior to public hearings and all the rest of that stuff. That's that get an early contact going and try and make sure it happens.
Thank you. Can you explain a little bit more about your risk, the acceptable level of risk, and how you explain that to the client? Like, do you, as I know you said something like a 10 to 20-year storm, but do you bring, what else, what do you kind of talk about?
Well, a 10-year storm has certain characteristics about it. Its frequency of return, the wave characteristics, and then if you integrate into that what the wave energy environment is in the location that you're at, you can show a client that, you know, we could design a project that's going to give you protection to the 100-year level. But to do that, we need to, as Laura pointed out in her presentation, you may need a structure which gives you 5 to 7 feet of elevation beyond the high tide line. And so you get that protection, but at what cost? Number one, and that is a financial cost, but also there is an ecological and a societal cost. The ecological cost is that chances are in the current environment, and I hate to do this again, but let's go to Sandy. I put in a 7-foot-high bulkhead, and I've got a 13-foot storm surge. I'm significantly short of the height of that storm surge elevation, and that doesn't even include the wave that's on top of it. So you could be looking at, you know, on a 7-foot bulkhead, you could be looking at 8 or 9 feet of water and wave coming in at you over the top of the structure. So what have you obtained by putting in a structure that's good for the 100-year storm? You need to be reasonable and practicable. There are certainly places where you have to design to the storm of record. Let's take Battery Park in New York City. The Battery Park seawall is at an elevation of approximately 8 feet. If we put the Sandy storm surge of 13 feet on top of it, is it any wonder that downtown Manhattan was underwater and the Battery Park tunnel was flooded, as were the path and subway tunnels throughout the city? No. And those buildings that were adjacent to the park received a tremendous amount of flooding. And where was all of their infrastructure? You know, everything from furnaces and water heaters to, you know, elevator engines and emergency services equipment, all underwater. So, yeah, I mean, it's, in New York City, you might need to go to 13 feet because you've got that much infrastructure. But out here at the yacht club, I mean, sometimes you just got to let it go with the idea that, I'm sorry, go.
Oh, Mike, when you talk then about risk reduction, you're talking not just about, say, the energy, but also the level of flooding, because I always think of this more as an erosion protection versus a flood protection. So when you talk to the yacht club, do you then talk about the elevation, not just kind of the energy and what will hold their shore?
Oh, certainly, because with each storm, you get a different elevation. And then, you know, they need to understand that, as I started this presentation, you are not going to be able to stop all of the problems that arise from storm events striking your project. And people need to have an appreciation for that.
Okay. And finally, I have one more question. What monitoring, if any, will be implemented to demonstrate erosion reduction performance? And I know Laura says that in New York State you have to monitor vegetation for 5 years. Yeah,
the state of Connecticut is similar to that. It varies with the project and the types of vegetations and what you're doing in there, but 3 to 5 years is typical. We like to chase things out about a decade, because what we find is that after about year 5, sometimes marshes do strange things. They tend to have a dieback, or at least a stem number per square foot reduction that we like to keep track of, just to make sure that, you know, whether it's a biological deterioration of the soils or something like that is not happening and needs to be amended or modified somehow.
So I assume also that there's a difference between what you're monitoring for the state regulatory, but also what you're doing for your client. And that goes back to the you're looking back 10 years. And yeah, I guess.
Yeah, one of the things that you will learn from the regulatory process is, and it used to make me completely crazy when I worked for the feds. The Corps of Engineers will tell you, we don't regulate constructability and function. We just regulate that you meet whatever goals and objectives are appropriate to the site. So you can build a project that's going to fall in the water next Wednesday afternoon, and they don't really care, as long as it doesn't, you know, it doesn't have a significant adverse environmental impact or represent a navigational threat, enough to make you very upset.
That's interesting. I wonder if there's any more questions. One of the things that you can do is raise your hand and I can try to unmute you. And otherwise, I don't have any other questions myself. And I'll just keep watching that. All right. Okay, I really want to just talk about the, all right, you should see my slide presentation now. And I wanted to reiterate that we are going to have more webinars. We're going to go into March, and you can sign up either through our website or through the SurveyMonkey link that you got. And there's more information that I need to tell you. One is, again, thank you for participating. When you sign out, you will get an evaluation. Please take the evaluation. It's important for our performance measures. If you are in a group, I would like to have you send me the entire attendance list. And my email is emily.hauser@dec.ny.gov. And if you want engineering credits, I need you to send me this information: your first name, your last name, your organization, your email, your title, city, state, and zip code. And then you can get your engineering credit for this event. And if I'm going to just check once more if we have any questions. And if not, then I just want to thank all our participants and say that we do put these presentations and and the archived webinar up on our website, which you see here. So oh, and I just want to say whether or not Mike or Laura have anything more to say. So Mike?
Yeah, I have my project manager for that, for the yacht club, wrote me a little note that said they did do some planting of American beach grass in the upper portion of the core mat above the tidal height of the salt marsh, she tells me, but that was about it.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that clarification. And Laura, do you have anything to say? All right, I think
she may have gone offline.
Yeah. Okay, so again, thank you all for your participation, and we'll look forward to seeing you the 3rd Friday of December when we're going to talk about urban shorelines and a prioritization analysis. Thank you, and have a great weekend.
Thank you, Emily. You also, and a better Thanksgiving.
Thank you.